Are you willing to put aside all speculation and announce to the people here that you are not running in 2020? No.
Overall, wages are down. People are working longer hours for less money. Obama keeps current illegal immigrants.
African Americans being mistreated in society.
Noting that world leaders laughed at President Trump.
Amendment
Thanks
right.
to the president's ruling trade war.
You know what it is? Our new slogan, 2020. Keep America great.
Hello, I'm Drew Sheldrick. Thanks for listening to this latest episode of 2020 Vision. The past week in US politics has been dominated by the so-called squad of Democratic congresswomen who were the focus of persistent attacks by President Donald Trump. Trump, who told the 4 women of colour, 3 of whom were born in the United States, to go back to where they came from, has been criticised for what many commentators have argued is a clarion call for the more extreme elements of the Republican base, as tensions increase over race and immigration in the lead-up to the 2020 election. Let's have a listen to how the squad rose to political prominence in recent days.
The president saying the congresswomen, all women of color, originally came from countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe. Adding, why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came?
Color, all are U.S. citizens.
Does it concern you that many people saw that tweet as racist and that white nationalist groups are finding common cause with you on that point?
It's hard to keep on being civil when they ask you such naive questions.
It doesn't concern me because many people agree with me.
A prominent website today saying this is the kind of white nationalism we elected him for.
They hate America. They think America was wicked in its origins, and it's even more wicked today.
I am not surprised at what he's doing, but I also know that we're focused on making it better because we don't leave the things that we love. And when we love this country, what that means is that we propose the solutions to fix it. We love all people in this country. And so we'll stay focused on our agenda. And we won't get caught slipping. Because all of this is a distraction.
Xenophobic, bigoted remarks from the occupant of our White House. I will always refer to him as the occupant, as he is only occupying space.
You can't talk that way about our country. Not when I'm the president. So I think they've said horrible things. They're anti-Semitic. And you look at the kind of statements they've made about Israel, it's a disgrace.
In condemning the president's racist tweets. To do anything less would be a shocking rejection of our values and a shameful abdication of our oath of office to protect the American people.
Dr. Gorana Grgic has just returned from 6 months abroad at Harvard University's Minda-Gunsberg Centre for European Studies. She's an expert in transatlantic relations and lectures in US politics and foreign policy here at the University of Sydney. Gorana, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be back in Sydney.
As we just heard, last week was dominated by President Trump's attacks on 4 congresswomen of colour, otherwise known as the Squad. We've seen race used as a pillar of Trump's campaigns and policies before, but what was it about this particular incident, do you think, that really seemed to unsettle people internationally as well as domestically?
Well, what's been happening over the past week has really opened up the question of the nature of American national identity, I would say, namely who counts as an American. And if I may use my academic hat here, there was actually a really great book on the very topic with the same question, who counts as an American, that was published back in 2009 by Elizabeth Tice Morse, an American professor, who showed that actually people who identify more strongly as the kind of prototype member of a particular nation are less likely to consider those that don't fit that prototype as truly members of their own group or of their nation, or in fact extend certain rights or benefits to them. The reason why I'm saying this is because obviously the tweets by President Trump have clearly clearly signaled that he doesn't count certain Americans, in specific these 4 congresswomen, as Americans, simply because they look different, because they pray different than what he considers to be the norm, and that is kind of white Christian, right? And this is really, the reason why this has really unsettled people, not just in the United States, but all around the world, is because it's really in clear contradiction to what the United States should stand for, where citizenship and membership of the nation is based not on the right of blood, as it is in some European states, but really it's about the subscription to a civic creed that's been elaborated on in the founding documents, from the Declaration of Independence to its constitution. So President Trump in these tweets has just continued with his nativist rhetoric, with some of the policies that have been enacted or that have been tried to be enacted. And, if we look at it in this sort of long arc of his political career, it's basically the extension of birtherism around President Obama, right? Because of the way he looks, because of what his middle name is, or questioning, whether a judge would be fair given that he has Mexican heritage, et cetera, et cetera. So we come back to this question of conditional citizenship, of patriotism, right? Who is allowed to criticize the United States if they don't fit that sort of prototype of who is supposed to be a member of this American nation, according to President Trump.
Trump appeared at a rally in North Carolina a short time after those initial tweets attacking these women. Crowds there chanted, "Send her back," which is sort of an update of the "lock her up" chants, I think, from the 2016 campaign. Was this kind of ramping up of the base or the more extreme parts of the base, do you think, what he was intending? Can we expect sort of more of this in the lead up to 2020?
I would definitely expect there'll be more of the playing of the identity politics and this race card as we head into the general election year. But here is where Democrats really need to be careful, because this is exactly the ground that President Trump wants him on. It was Steve Bannon, if I'm not mistaken, who said, I would love them to just, talk about identity and race all the time, because this is actually what helps President Trump's cause. And
that was Trump's former campaign manager.
Exactly. Yep. And still kind of this sort of looming presence somewhere in the background. But what we can see happened in 2018 midterm elections is exactly the sort of strategy that Democrats employed, that was based exactly against playing identity politics or racial cards, right? Not getting baited to respond to some of these provocations. And there were a number of those, obviously. But they knew that if they wanted to flip the House, at least, they needed to win those moderates. And the risk here is getting the Democrats to be perceived so far to the left and constantly playing and replaying this identity politics that they might actually push away some of the independents who aren't as concerned about these topics, who would rather be hearing about, healthcare or plans to, restructure the way that the education system works, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a peril really of getting further into this debate. Not to say, obviously, that some of these issues are very important, and we shouldn't obviously deflect from the fact that there is clear kind of racist motivation behind this. But equally, for political purposes, for political gains, Democrats would be wiser to stay on topic and stay on issues rather than just get into the values game, because this is where President Trump wants them to be.
Because there is a lot of stake here, right? We've seen some tension between the Democratic leadership like Nancy Pelosi and these 4 congresswomen in particular. So you think that this could likely exploit these sort of tensions and differences rather than bring Democrats together in the defense of these women?
Certainly. If you manage to, the sort of old Latin proverb, divide et impera, the divide and then rule is a strategy that's been well employed, again, in a number of campaigns. So you would like to, ideally, from the perspective of the current incumbent in the White House, to divide his opposition, right, to make Nancy Pelosi and the four congresswomen sort of these enemies, but who aren't actually coalescing so that their enemy, makes them friends. Having said that, this is a sort of divide that we've seen in the Democratic Party essentially since November last year, since the midterms, because you do have this tension between the old guard and the new guard, right? Nancy Pelosi has been in D.C. for 3 decades now, over 3 decades, right? She understands that incrementalism is the way to go, but the new blood, right, they want to challenge the president more forcefully. They don't want to kind of drop the idea of impeachment. They don't want to yield. And that might be a kind of factor of their age, right? And the kind of maybe lack of political experience, but also their firm commitment to some of these principles. And actually, this is something that their constituents are expecting them to do. They come from solidly blue districts, right, where there isn't that much of a calculation or kind of the need to maybe moderate some of that message, right? So they are pursuing this sort of tactic. And again, Democrats would be much wiser to leave those differences for now aside and again focus on the message. They've done great in 2018. If they want to go ahead and have a real good chance in 2020, these sort of differences should be parked aside at least for now, so that they present a more unison voice towards President Trump, but also in appealing to the broader public.
Trump cited the defense of Israel as one of the reasons he told these women to go back to where they came from. How did Israel and sort of anti-Semitism become a part of this debate? Because it's been raised quite a few times in the past week.
Well, this is a classical sort of a deflection strategy and a case of whataboutism. It's basically like this schoolyard argument that they are having, I'm not racist, you're racist, right? And down the spiral we go. Clearly, there have been issues there with some of the past tweets and statements by Representative Ilhan Omar. She's apologized for those, and they did revolve around some of these tropes and stereotypes about Jews in the United States in particular.
It was about lobbying on behalf of Israel? Is that was the
absolutely.
Original?
And this is where we get now to this sort of issue that has reappeared in American politics time and again, but also in other places around the world where, criticism of Israeli policy at the moment, right, should not be equated with anti-Semitism, because obviously, this is where as part of political strategy, President Trump would like to get to, right? He is now kind of speaking to two audiences, I would say. First of all, to some of the kind of staunchest members of his base that garnered this anti-Muslim sentiment. So they are already prone to seeing Ilhan Omar as, as a Muslim congresswoman, as, with some suspicion, let's put it that way. But also he's appealing to other parts of his either potential, constituency or even base from the evangelicals who naturally have kind of predispositions to defend Israel based on some of the religious beliefs, but also parts of the Jewish community, obviously, which can't be taken as a homogeneous in the United States, right? They're more orthodox part of that community that are actually sensitive to some of these attacks and that do see this kind of attack on Israel as problematic. And President Trump is trying to tap into some of those votes as well.
Britain has a new Prime Minister after a vote of the Conservative Party members overnight. Where do you think the US relationship with the UK is headed under Prime Minister Boris Johnson?
Well, it's notable that President Trump was actually one of the first ones to congratulate Boris Johnson on becoming the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And it seems that a lot of commentary has revolved around how similar the two men are, not just in physical appearance. I think there was one of the late night shows said that Boris Johnson looked like Donald Trump if he was transported into kind of Dickensian era. I think it was Colbert or something. But all jokes aside, certainly the two men see eye to eye, at least in some of the populist rhetoric. But I think their personal histories are a bit different. And I would urge everyone to go and check out Boris Johnson, debating Mary Beard on kind of the classics, ancients, who would win, Rome or Greece, in kind of, getting a sense of who Boris Johnson is. And I would say he is a very skillful politician who has put on this persona of a shambolic character. But I think there is a lot of calculus behind that. And finally, his dream of becoming the PM of the United Kingdom has come true. Now, having, this sort of agenda of getting the United Kingdom out of the European Union is going to take probably most of his bandwidth. So where the space for the transatlantic cooperation might be when it comes to the US and the UK, we certainly have a lot of talk of a potential trade deal between the two, but that can only happen, nothing can get started while the United Kingdom is still in the European Union. So all talks will have to be postponed until that materializes, if it eventuates, obviously, given that the deadlines have come and gone. But the other thing that I think is really going to be pressing the moment that Prime Minister Johnson steps into Downing 10 is the issue of Iran. Obviously, over the past week, we've seen certain developments that have implicated now the United Kingdom more into what's been happening, the tensions in the Persian Gulf with the seizure of the British tanker and a part of their crew that's being held now by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And this is something that might test Prime Minister Johnson in terms of where he wants to place the United Kingdom in the rift that has been created after the United States has withdrawn from the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran deal as it's known more broadly. So whether the UK will actually side with the United States in reimposing sanctions and being much harsher to Iran, or whether it's going to go down the line its European Union colleagues have been going, which is setting up this facility to bypass sanctions, to still try to pretend, that they're committed to the deal, even though now Iran is obviously doing things that are suggesting that they aren't committed either, and obviously has stepped up efforts to restart its nuclear program.
You've just returned from Harvard's Center for European Studies, where you're a visiting scholar for 6 months. What was the focus of your work and research while you were there?
So one huge chunk of my time was spent basically working on my book project, which is basically trying to make this sort of idea of deprioritization in foreign policy happen. So we often talk about grand strategies and, what the United States does when it starts focusing on certain issues or regions more closely. But what I'm looking at is what does the U.S. foreign policy look like in places or regarding issues when they fall out of the sort of center of attention, or when they don't really top the kind of policy agenda. And the region where I'm looking at that sort of dynamics is actually the Balkans after the 90s. So the United States for much of the 90s has been sort of laser-eyed focused, especially since Bosnia intervention, then following in Kosovo, has been very involved in that part of the world. And then obviously because of 9/11, but also because of certain strategic choices that the Bush administration made has kind of made that region less of a priority, and it hasn't been really in the kind of center of the gaze of administrations from Bush onwards. But still, that doesn't mean just because the U.S. leaves that regions get suddenly stabilized, or that you can actually break this sort of path dependence that has been created. So I'm essentially looking at how is foreign policy made once, the White House decides it's no longer a priority, but there are different push and pull factors from within the United States, as well as that region in particular, that still want to see America involved. And tracing how this has been evolving over the past 2 decades. So just this year, we've celebrated the 20th anniversary of Kosovo War. And I can just tell you, given that I've been in the region, the region is far from being the kind of beacon of democracy that everyone would have hoped for. If anything, the democratic backsliding, some of the sort of, call to arms that we've seen in some parts of the region are suggesting that we have a lot of unfinished business to deal with in that part of the world.
What was the feeling among scholars about European relations with the United States at the moment when you're at Harvard? I know a lot of your colleagues over there are former sort of European leaders, sort of moved into academia. So, I mean, a lot of the focus has obviously been on potential damage to NATO during the Trump era, but are there greater areas of concern perhaps that you picked up among those colleagues?
Yeah, so I was there actually at a great time, a sort of momentous period in terms of, the first deadline for Brexit had passed. We've had numerous panels on that. There were obviously European parliamentary election, which have now yielded finally. We've had the confirmation of the new president of the EU Commission, and we have a whole new leadership that will be coming in from fall, European fall or our spring. And obviously there was the 70th anniversary of the NATO alliance, which brought about a lot of discussions around the internal challenges to the alliance, from the lack of American leadership, from the standard lines of European underinvestment in their defense and the need to kind of boost that up. Or also now more and more talk about the fact that NATO is not just a military alliance, it's a kind of political community of countries that should be subscribing to democratic ideals. And we know, from Turkey to Poland to Hungary, a lot of them are falling way short of those ideals, to external challenges, obviously Russia as the immediate challenge, but also China kind of on the rise and starting to pose some questions even for the alliance, but also, issues of out of area operations, what to do with Afghanistan now, because NATO is essentially a kind of a spearheading force there, and some other things. But what struck me the most was really the number of discussions, roundtables, conferences even, that had China at its focus. Right. So EU-China relations were... What surprised me really was coming from this part of the world where we can't escape China, right? Yeah. And obviously in kind of the discussions on the future of the Indo-Pacific and what would be the kind of best way to negotiate the great power relations here, it seems that European Union has just woken up to the challenge that China poses. And we've seen actually, it was only in March of this year that the EU came out with this strategic outlook where for the first time it has used the term strategic rival for China. All of this time, right, China has been viewed solely as a partner or even as a kind of friend and a close kind of collaborator on issues of global governance. But now the EU is seeing China differently. And it's quite interesting because obviously, as with all things that have to do with EU policy making, there are a lot of kind of dissenting voices. Italy has joined the Belt and Road Initiative just earlier this year, so the first G7 country to do that. And some of the kind of, Eastern European countries that have naturally gravitated towards China because they have been kind of starved of money, and they are really hungry for investments, and China was there to do that. So Greece joined the 16+1 initiative, making it now 17+1 and so on. So all of these different developments are posing a lot of challenges for the incoming EU leadership, and I suspect that we are going to hear much more about the role China is going to play in Europe and the extent to which EU is going to be, willing to make this sort of trade-off of, getting the investments in return for, some sort of acquiescence to what China's been doing. So I think this is really the space to be kind of following. I'll certainly follow it with interest, but I think in terms of potential, partnerships and kind of, shifting sort of coalitions, if you wish, in world affairs, this is one of the developments that is certainly one to look out for.
Just finally, next week we'll see a rematch of the Democratic presidential hopefuls for 2020 in two CNN debates. Do you expect foreign policy or even transatlantic relations to come up this time, or are we sort of set for another sort of domestic policy matchup, do you think?
Can I be brutally honest?
Of course, yes, please. We welcome it.
I think that if we hear transatlantic relations in that debate, I don't know, I'm going to have a really long drink or something. I would be willing to kind of bet that, transatlantic relations will not come. That's true, right? But I think the whole focus of these primaries is really on domestic policy. And I believe we'll hear more about healthcare. I think this is one of the topics where we are now seeing a clear kind of difference. Finally, somewhere, where you can see the candidates kind of spar and start fighting out what the visions are under their perspective, or what would be the kind of policy under their perspective administration. So between the public option and Medicare for all, I think this is kind of now pretty crystallized as to who would be in which camp. I think climate change is going to probably be one of the more important issues on the table. And then, just now with the Mueller testimony that's going to happen, to what extent, some of these issues around holding the president to account will come up.
Potentially.
Exactly. Yeah. We are likely to see the Congress, from all the sort of kind of insider accounts we've been hearing from DC, is that in the fall, when the Congress comes back from its recess, we'll see even more of the committee hearings and oversight and so on. So where do the candidates stand on some of these issues? And if foreign policy comes up, I think it will probably come and kind of be focused on Iran primarily. So here we might hear a bit about the Europeans, but I don't think we'll hear much more on that. And certainly China as the sort of standing issue in U.S. foreign policy, the kind of greatest story of the centuries.
Gorana, thank you very much for joining us, and welcome back.
It was a pleasure and great to be here.
Thanks this week to Free Martins, Ketzer and the Baba Mara Brass Band for their musical contributions, and to the University of Sydney's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences for their studio assistance.